Hine Lo Yonum by Shlomo Simcha and A.B. Rotenberg. We're working our way through a new album. It's called Aish. Aish, Aleph, Shin, A.B. Rotenberg, and Shlomo Simcha. How's everybody doing? A good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you. It's great to be starting the week with some beautiful Torah learning. Kind of late on a Saturday night, but we're heading into summer. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Saturday night? Looks like the numbers are low. It's difficult in the summer. Paula in Chicago, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, and Yitzhak in Kansas City. Welcome, everybody. We are opening a new chapter. This is chapter 6 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of yibum. We're doing page 54 tonight, but we're starting it on 53b, where chapter 6 begins. Chapter 5 was really just one Mishna, one set of questions. Here, chapter 6, more of a regular chapter. I think there's 9 Mishnas in this chapter. And you know, this is so Talmudic, what we're going to be doing tonight. As we've seen over and over again, if a man dies without having children and he leaves a widow and a brother, so the widow and the brother have an obligation to get married and have a child and to become the heir of the man who died before he could have a child. They have the option not to get married and instead to perform chalitza, a ceremony which is also a mitzvah, and then they are free to go their separate ways. In chapter 5, we were examining the nuances and ramifications of these extra steps that could be added into that process. On the one hand, it's actually what the sages commanded, that before they should perform yibum, meaning before the brother-in-law should have intercourse with the widow and thereby get married, they should perform a levirate betrothal. If they then decided to break it off before performing yibum, they would also need a get, a bill of divorce, and chalitza before they're free to go their separate ways. So yibum is normally performed by bia, intercourse. Okay, so we've just mentioned that over and over again as something that you do if you're going to perform yibum, and the Torah specifically says that the brother who is going to build up his brother's house shall have intercourse with the widow. Now, in completely, absolutely, like extra, what am I trying to say? Like exactly the way the sages of the Talmud would have to proceed, they're now going to look at intercourse itself. What constitutes intercourse? What if they kind of do it but don't do it? What if they begin to have sex but then change their minds? What if there's weird circumstances surrounding the fact that they have intercourse? Is it somehow disqualified? So in other words, they're defining intercourse, what actually counts as intercourse and what doesn't. Now, you know, to the modern mind, or the people who didn't grow up in schooling themselves in a yeshiva and examining every single parameter of every mitzvah. I mean, if you're talking about tefillin in the Talmud, they're going to say, well, which exact parchments have to go into the box that goes on your arm and the one in your head? And what if one of those documents is off by one letter? What if the sofer, the scribe, didn't have the correct intent when he was drafting the parchment, etc.? Well, they're going to apply exactly the same kind of meticulous analysis and investigation and rooting in the written Torah, right? So that anything that they say has to have basis in the Torah. We've talked many times that the sages will sometimes issue a decree for purposes of policy. But nevertheless, it's only to draw a fence around the written Torah, and there has to be some justification and basis in the Torah itself for any rabbinic decree. So as we'll see tonight, when they define what intercourse is, they will look to the Torah for those definitions and to be very precise. Let's not be prudish and squeamish and think, oh my gosh, we're talking about sex. The bottom line is, sex is a human function like every other part of human living, and to do it in the way that God wills for us to do it is going to require careful examination, and that's what we're getting into tonight. So, chapter 6, Mishnah number 1. One who had intercourse with his Yevamos, so the brother-in-law with the widow, whether unwittingly, how can you unwittingly have sex, i.e. he thought he was having intercourse with someone else, or intentionally, i.e. he knew that she was his Yevama and nevertheless had intercourse with her, though without intent to perform yibum. Right? Maybe he was just attracted to her and now his brother's dead and he's going to go have sex and he wasn't thinking that I'm thereby going to marry her. Has he become married to her via the process of yibum? So one who had intercourse with his Yevama, whether unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to coercion, we'll discuss what that means, or willingly, even if he was unwitting and her participation was intentional, or his participation was intentional and she was unwitting, whether he was coerced and she was not coerced, or she was coerced and he was not coerced, both one who merely engages in the initial stage of intercourse and one who completes the act of intercourse, all of these cases, he has thereby acquired his Yevama, meaning they're married. And similarly, the Torah did not distinguish between an act of intercourse in a typical manner or one in an atypical manner, meaning whether it was done the normal way we have sex or if it was done as anal intercourse. And so too with regard to a man who had intercourse with any one of those with whom relations are forbidden, the arayos, by the Torah, or with those who are unfit for him, even though they are not in the category of arayos, the forbidden relations listed in the Torah. In other words, somebody that you're prohibited to have sex with, when have you committed the transgression of having sex with them? Right? Same question, right? So here, and likewise, whether you did it wittingly or unwittingly, right, etc. So, for example, a widow with a high priest, right? A high priest cannot marry a widow, and a regular priest cannot marry a divorcee, nor a chalutza. Nor can a regular Jew have intercourse with a mamzeret, right? A woman who is a mamzer. Nor a Gibeonite woman with an Israelite, nor the daughter of an Israelite with a mamzer or a Gibeonite. If they do have sex, he has disqualified her from marrying into the priesthood through this act, no matter how it was performed. And the Torah did not distinguish between the act of intercourse in an atypical manner, meaning anal intercourse, nor intercourse in a typical manner. That is the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. What is the significance of the word even in the statement that begins with, even if he was unwitting and her participation was intentional? Since the Mishnah has already said that there is no halachic difference whether the act of intercourse was performed intentionally, then what is added by the statement that even if one of them was intentional and the other one was not intentional, since they already said it doesn't matter if it was unintentional, what is the purpose of this statement? And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah is stated in the style of, needless to say, It is needless to say that if he was unwitting and she intended to fulfill the mitzvah, or alternatively, he acted intentionally without intent to fulfill the mitzvah, and she intended to fulfill the mitzvah, even so, he has acquired her. They are now married. However, even if he was unwitting and she acted intentionally, where both of them did not intend to act for the sake of the mitzvah, he nevertheless acquires her. Similarly, Rabbi Chia taught, even if both of them acted unwittingly, intentionally, or were coerced, he acquires the Yevama through the act of intercourse. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances that the Mishnah is referring to when it mentions a man who was coerced? How can a man be coerced to have sex? So the sages immediately acknowledge a man can rape a woman. How can a man be coerced into sex? In other words, can a man be raped? So if we say that it is when Gentiles coerced him by threatening to kill him if he did not have intercourse with her, and he therefore had intercourse with her, but didn't Rava say that there is no such thing as coercion of a man to have intercourse with a woman with whom relations are forbidden, because there is no erection of the male organ without intent? Consequently, even if he acted due to the threat, his action is considered intentional. Right? Remember that those are the three cardinal sins that you're not allowed to perform even under threat of death. Right? To kill another person, you can't kill another. Someone puts a gun to your head and says, kill him or I'm going to kill you. You're not allowed to kill that guy. His blood is not redder than yours, so you are not allowed to commit murder in order to prevent yourself from being murdered. Likewise, even with a gun to your head, you cannot engage in prohibited sexual union nor in idolatry. For those three sins, you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed rather than performing them. Here, Rava is saying, if a man gets an erection, then whatever he does next, he did on purpose, right? They did like if somebody's like literally, sticking your thing into a place where it doesn't belong, Rav is saying you're not going to have an erection at that moment. So if they stuck it in, you would not have intent. But if you develop the erection somehow, then you would have intent. You made that choice. Rather, the Mishnah must be referring, so what does it mean, coercion? The Mishnah must be referring to one who was sleeping and he became erect, and his Yevama drew him onto herself. However, didn't Rav Yehuda say that a sleeping man has not acquired his Yevama, right? If you're asleep and somehow you just happen to have an erection in your sleep and, a woman climbed on top of you and had sex with you, well, then you weren't even conscious. In that situation, you didn't perform any act. You did not perform intercourse. There, you were just unconscious of what was happening. And there, you did not acquire her as a wife, nor would you have transgressed if that happened to you with a prohibited relation, like incest or something like that, as he did not intend to perform the act of intercourse at all. So that must not be the case that we're talking about of coercion. Rather, the Mishnah was referring to one who was inserted into his Yevama by accident. But didn't Rabbah say, one who fell from a roof and was inserted into a woman due to the force of his fall is liable to pay 4 of the 5 types of indemnity, damages that must be paid by one who has damaged another person: injury, pain, medical costs, and loss of livelihood. However, he is not liable to pay for the shame he caused her, as he did not intend to perform the act. And if she is his Yevama, he has not acquired her in this manner. Somehow that you could stumble and fall and end up with your member inside someone. They're handling the case. Seems like in a gazillion years, how could that ever happen? But just in case it happened, they've covered it. So rather, coercion must mean a case where he intended to have intercourse with his wife and he became erect, and his Yevama forcefully grabbed hold of him and he had intercourse with her instead. So the Gemara further asks, if so, what are the circumstances of the case when both of them were coerced, that was mentioned by the school of Rabbi Chia? And the Gemara answers, it is a case where he intended to have intercourse with his wife, and Gentiles grabbed hold of him and pressed him and his Yevama against each other, and he thereby had intercourse with her. Now, that seems so extreme and unlikely and impossible that what they're basically saying is, well, we've covered the case where they were both coerced to have sex with each other, but any excuse that you come up with where you claim that you were coerced to have sex probably isn't going to wash, right? Probably isn't going to hold. Now, the Gemara inquires as to the source of these laws. How do we know that any act of intercourse, whether in the typical manner or the atypical manner, whether intentional or unwitting or coerced, whether it intent to perform the mitzvah of yibum or not, if he has it with his Yevama, they're now going to consider that they made yibum and they're married. How do we know that? So from where are these matters derived? As the sages taught with regard to the verse, our operative verse on yibum, Deuteronomy 25:5, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her. Let's just read the whole verse for a second. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and he has no child, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside of the family to one not of his kin. Her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her and take her to him to be his wife and consummate the levirate marriage. That's Deuteronomy 25:5. So, from the phrase, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her, we learn that this indicates that the act of intercourse in this circumstance is a mitzvah. It is commanded, and it is preferable to the alternative, which is chalitza. Right? He should build up his brother's family. She should marry the brother rather than outside the family. Alternatively, the verse, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her, indicates that it does not matter how he had intercourse with her, whether unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to coercion or willingly. The Gemara asks, didn't you derive from this phrase that the act of intercourse in this case is a mitzvah, that it is preferable to perform yibum than chalitza? How then can the same phrase also indicate that it does not matter what the intentions of the two parties were during the act of intercourse? And the Gemara answers, the fact that it is a mitzvah is derived from a different verse, Deuteronomy 25:7, where it says, and if the man does not wish to take his Yevama, the chalitza verse, which indicates that if he wishes, he performs levirate marriage, which is preferable to chalitza. Therefore, when the verse cited above came, it indicated that levirate marriage has occurred whether the parties acted unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to coercion or willingly. So it is taught in another baraisa that the phrase, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her, indicates that levirate marriage has been performed, has been performed if they engage in typical sexual intercourse. The next phrase, and take her, includes even atypical, i.e. anal sexual intercourse. And the concluding phrase of the verse, and consummate the levirate marriage, indicates that sexual intercourse completes her acquisition, but money and a marriage document do not complete her acquisition. In other words, they are not considered married in a yibum context if they do exchange of money or a marriage document to complete her acquisition to him as his fully betrothed wife, which is in contrast to the regular laws of marriage. In regular marriage, you become betrothed, right, by an exchange of an item of value or a marriage document, and then you're betrothed, you're married, and you would need a get to break that even if you hadn't consummated the union. But for a yibum to be complete, they must have intercourse, and until they do, they haven't performed yibum. By emphasizing and consummate the levirate marriage with her, the verse teaches that he acquires her even if he acted against her will. Alternatively, now that sounds terrible, and it is that if the brother-in-law in this situation, like she didn't want to perform yibum with him, she said, no, let's just do chalitza, and he raped her, that then they would end up married. That just seems intolerable to our mind. But remember, the effect of that is they're not going to have to stay married, but he's now going to have to provide for her because he did that. Right? So that's the flip side of saying, even if it was done against her will, they performed yibum, and now he has obligations toward her, legal obligations of support that a rapist wouldn't have, irrespective of what his punishment might be otherwise. Alternatively, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her indicates that levirate marriage has occurred whether the parties acted unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to coercion or willingly. The Gemara asks, didn't you derive from this phrase that levirate marriage has been performed if they engage in typical sexual intercourse? How can it also indicate that it does not matter what the intentions of the two parties were during the act of intercourse? And the Gemara answers, the law is derived from a different verse, to establish a name for his brother in Deuteronomy 25:7, which indicates that intercourse must occur in the place where he establishes a name, i.e., where it can lead to childbirth. Therefore, when the verse cited above came, it indicated that levirate marriage has occurred whether the parties acted unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to coercion or willingly. The Gemara addresses the matter itself in the previous discussion. We're well into 54a now, by the way. Rabbi Yehuda said, a sleeping man has not acquired his Yevama. As the verse states, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her, which indicates that he does not acquire her unless he intends to act for the sake of sexual intercourse. Note, it doesn't say he hasn't acquired her unless he intends to act for the sake of the mitzvah of yibum. He has to have an intention to have sex, even if his intention in having sex is just to have sex, or he thought he was having sex with somebody else, but it was with his Yevama. He just has to be intentionally having sex, whether or not he intended to get married to her through yibum. Since a sleeping man does not intend to engage in sexual intercourse, he does not acquire his Yevama. The Gemara asks, isn't it taught in a baraisa that one acquires his Yevama through sexual intercourse regardless of whether he was awake or asleep? The Gemara answers, say the baraisa in the following emended form, whether she was awake or asleep. The woman's awareness is not a necessary component in order to perform levirate marriage, which goes along with the same idea that if he raped her, he now has those obligations toward her. Likewise, if she wasn't awake, which is rape, it would have the same result. The Gemara asks further, wasn't it taught in another baraisa that one acquires his Yevama through sexual intercourse regardless of whether he was awake or he was asleep, and regardless of whether she was awake or she was asleep? And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here when the baraisa says that a sleeping man acquires his Yevama? It is referring to a man who is dozing. We've seen this concept before, right? If you're asleep, no, you're not conscious. You didn't know you were having sex. If you're awake, you knew that you were having sex. Doesn't matter what your intention was, who you thought you were having sex with. If it turns out you had sex with your Yevama, you're married. What is dozing? And we've seen this before. What are the circumstances of dozing? Rav Ashi said, one who is asleep but not asleep, awake but not awake. When, if they call him, he will answer, but he is unable to provide a reasonable answer. And when they later inform him of what happened, he remembers it. This is the state that you're in when you're watching a movie that you start late at night and halfway through you're like, what just happened? Then you ask your husband or your wife to tell you what happened for the last 15 minutes. That's dozing. The Gemara returns to the statement of Rabbah, cited earlier in order to discuss the matter itself that Rabbah addressed. Rabbah said, one who fell from a roof and was inserted into a woman due to the force of his fall is liable to pay 4 of the 5 types of indemnity that must be paid to one who damaged another. And if she is his Yevama, he has not acquired her in this accidental manner. He is liable to pay for injury, pain, loss of livelihood, and medical costs. However, he is not liable to pay for the shame he caused her. As the master said, one is not liable to pay for shame unless he intends to humiliate his victim. Consequently, one who fell from a roof accidentally is not liable to pay for the shame he caused the woman. Rava said, if he intended to press his sexual organ into a wall and he accidentally pressed it into his Yevama, he has not acquired her as he did not intend to engage in an act of sexual intercourse. However, if he intended to press his sexual organ into an animal and he pressed it into his Yevama, he has acquired her as he intended to act for the purpose of sexual intercourse, in this case bestiality. In general, it is some kind of sexual intercourse, and so if he ended up intending to do it with an animal but did it with his Yevama, he had intention, and therefore he is now married. We learned in the Mishnah that both one who merely begins the act of intercourse and one who completes it has acquired the Yevama through this act. Ula said, from where is it derived? Now we're going to enter this lengthy discussion of how we know that the beginning of intercourse constitutes intercourse. Right? Now, what's interesting, as usual, that it happens the way the Talmud is organized, they're not going to define what the beginning of intercourse is. Does that mean that they start having sex but they don't finish? That fluids are not exchanged, for example? Is that what it means that he didn't finish? Or does it mean that, he only just put it in a little bit and then took it out, changed his mind? Did he put it all the way in? How much of the member went in? They're not going to define that yet. Right now, what they're saying is, how do we know that the beginning of sex equals sex? That if you just have that initial stage, you've had sex, and whatever consequences would accrue to somebody who had sex in this situation accrue to you, even if you didn't finish. How do we know that? Ula said, from where is it derived that the initial stage of intercourse is considered an act of sexual intercourse by Torah law? As it is stated, and if a man shall lie with a woman having her sickness, and shall uncover her nakedness, he has made naked, ha'era, her fountain. The verse is referring to the first stage of intercourse, and from here it is derived that the initial stage of intercourse, ha'ara'ah, is considered sexual intercourse by Torah law. So the Gemara asks, we have found a source for the law in the case of a menstruating woman, that if you just have the beginning of sex with a menstruating woman, which obviously we've discussed many times, absolutely prohibited in Jewish law for a husband and wife to have sex when she's having her menses, or for 7 days afterwards, the counting clean days, then she immerses in the mikveh, waits nightfall, and then they're permitted to each other. If you have sex before that, you committed a grave sin. Even if you only had the initial stage of sex. And that's the source that we're getting here. Now, how do we know that if you're liable for having sex with a nida when you just have the beginning of sex, that is the same definition for getting married to a Yevama in the yibum situation, that if you just had the beginning of sex, it's like you had sex? That's the question now. We have found a source for this law in the case of a menstruating woman, the subject of the verse cited above. But from where is it derived that the initial stage of intercourse is considered sexual intercourse with the rest of those with whom relations are forbidden? That's also mentioned in our Mishna, right? That whether you had sex willingly or unwillingly, but coerced or etc., if you did that with the arayos, the women who are prohibited to a man because she's his sister or his mother or his aunt or his father's relations, etc., how do we know that the beginning of sex counts as sex for all those situations? And if you say, we should derive it from the law with regard to a menstruating woman, well, what comparison can be made to a menstruating woman, concerning whom the law is more stringent than others with whom relations are forbidden, in that she causes one who has intercourse with her to become ritually impure, right? A nida is a source of tuma, ritual impurity. And if you have sex with her, you not only committed the transgression of having sex with a nida, but you also became tameh. And before you could enter the temple, you would have to go through the purification for that tuma. Whereas if you have sex, incest with somebody that's prohibited to you, you committed the transgression. And if you did it unintentionally, you would have to bring a sin offering. And if you did it intentionally, you're going to have a bigger process of teshuvah that doesn't involve bringing a sacrifice when the temple is standing. But you don't become tameh by having that. So that's why the law is more stringent with regard to the nida, the menstruating woman. So rather, the law in other cases, in the case of the prohibited relations, comes from a verse about a brother's wife, as it is written, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is impurity. Right now, you're not allowed to have sex with your brother's wife. Yibum comes and overrides that when a man died without having a child, and that's the only exception to this law. Otherwise, you can never have relations with your sister-in-law, your brother's wife, even if your brother dies or divorces her. You can never have relations with her. And when Leviticus states that at 20:21, it says, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is impurity." And it uses the word nida, right? It's like having sex with a nida. But it actually says it is impurity. We're translating impurity as just nida. So the word nida generally refers to a menstruating woman, but here it's just used to mean impurity. And so the Gemara asks, is his brother's wife always menstruating? No, rather it means that the law with regard to her is like that of a menstruating woman. And just as one is liable to receive punishment for violating the prohibition against engaging in sexual intercourse with a menstruating woman through the initial stage of intercourse, even if he doesn't finish the intercourse, so too one is liable to receive punishment for violating the prohibition against engaging in sexual intercourse with a brother's wife, even if he only has the initial stage of intercourse. So the Gemara asks, what comparison can be made between a brother's wife and other women with whom relations are forbidden? The prohibition with regard to a brother's wife is more stringent in that it is within his power to increase the number of women forbidden by this prohibition, as if he wishes, he can go on betrothing 1,000 women. Right? If a man betroths 1,000 women, he's going to have to deal with that, and maybe he's going to have to give a get to all 1,000 women. But once he did that, his brother cannot have sex with any of those women ever again. So a man has it in his power to render a bunch of women prohibited to his brother, which in the case of the other forbidden relations doesn't exist. Consequently, the prohibition with regard to a brother's wife cannot serve as a model for the other prohibitions, so we still don't know how we know that the beginning of intercourse counts as intercourse in the case of all those prohibited relations listed in the Torah. Rather, the law in other cases comes from a verse with regard to a father's sister and a mother's sister, as it is written, Leviticus 20:19, "And you shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, nor of your father's sister, for he has made naked, he'era, his kin." And the Gemara asks, it is possible to refute this source as follows. What comparison can be made between other women with whom relations are forbidden and a father's sister and a mother's sister, which are unique in that they are prohibited due to a prohibition that comes on its own? What does that mean? The prohibition with regard to a father's sister and a mother's sister does not stem from marriage, right? You could have a father and a sister, even if your father didn't marry your mother. Still, somebody fathered you and he has a sister. So there's no marriage involved here, not necessarily. The prohibition with regard to a father's sister and mother's sister do not stem from marriage, but from the biological fact that she is his father's sister or his mother's sister. It is therefore dissimilar to prohibitions that result from marriage, like the list of the arroyos, the prohibited unions. So the Gemara states the principle that the initial stage of intercourse is considered sexual intercourse does not come from any one of the sources above, because we found a way to disprove that it would apply here. So the Gemara asks, well, therefore, from which two sources could this principle be derived? In other words, perhaps we don't have a flat-out, inarguable source from any one of those three verses, but maybe we could take two of the three at a time, take them together, and say that these two verses will combine to become a proof text that the beginning of intercourse, it counts as intercourse. In our case is what we want to get back to in yibum, but also in the case of all the prohibited relations that are mentioned in our Mishna. So the Gemara asks, from which two sources could this principle come to be derived? If you say it comes to be derived from the combination of the source with regard to a brother's wife and the source with regard to a father's sister and mother's sister, what comparison may be drawn from these cases, which are unique in that they are prohibited because they are relatives? Rather, let it come from the prohibition prescribing a menstruating woman. So you're not allowed to have sex with a menstruating woman, whether she's a relative or not. and the prohibition with regard to a father, sister, and mother, sister. As a menstruating woman is not prohibited as a family relative, she's just prohibited because she's menstruating. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. What comparison may be drawn from these cases, which are each a prohibition that comes of its own accord, as neither one is created through marriage, no connection to marriage. Rather, let it come from the prohibition prescribing a menstruating woman and the prohibition prescribing a brother's wife. As, what can you say to refute this teaching? These two cases do not share any unique features that might be cause for stringency. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, strongly objects to this. What comparison may be drawn based upon the precedent of a menstruating woman and a brother's wife, which are stringent in that they cannot be permitted to others for the duration of the existence of the factor that renders them prohibited? A menstruating woman is forbidden as long as she experiences a flow of menstrual blood plus the 7 days, while a brother's wife is forbidden for the duration of the brother's lifetime. What, didn't you just say you can never marry that woman unless, even if the brother dies? But in the case of yibum, she will become permitted. Can you say the same with regard to a married woman who can become permitted during the lifetime? Can you say the same with regard to a married woman who can become permitted during the lifetime of the one who renders her prohibited? In other words, if her husband divorces her. That is a difference that seems to undermine this proof. So Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, is that to say that it is only during the existence of the factor that renders them prohibited that a menstruating woman and a brother's wife cannot become permitted to others, but afterward, when the prohibiting factor has been resolved, they can be permitted? In the case of a menstruating woman, the matter depends upon days, not blood. Although the flow of blood causes her to become impure, she remains impure for a full 7 days, regardless of whether she continues to experience menstrual bleeding for the duration of that time period. And similarly, in the case of a brother's wife, the merciful one makes her forbidden status dependent upon children, as if she has children, she remains forbidden to the husband's brother even after the husband dies. It's only when they didn't have children together that she will become permitted as a Yevama. Rather, now we're on 54b, the Gemara refutes the derivation in the following manner. What comparison can be drawn from a menstruating woman and a brother's wife, which are unique in that what renders them prohibited does not render them permitted? Each becomes permitted due to an external factor, i.e. the passing of 7 days or the death of her childless husband. Can you say that the halachas, the laws of these cases, apply to a married woman whose prohibited status is different in that the one who renders her prohibited to the rest of the world, i.e. her husband, has the capacity to render her permitted to the rest of the world by divorcing her? Rather, the Gemara offers another source for the law. Remember, we're still trying to derive a Torah source for the law that the beginning of sex equals sex, in the case of the prohibited relations. So Rabbi Yonah said, and some say it was Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua. The verse states, at the end of the chapter on forbidden relations, for whoever shall do any of these abominations, the souls that do them shall be cut off. That's Leviticus 18:29. All those with whom relations are forbidden are compared to each other in this verse, and therefore also to a menstruating woman. We know that in the case of the menstruating woman, the beginning of sex equals sex. Here we have a link to having sex with the prohibited relations seems to be tied to the law of a menstruating woman, and therefore we would have a source for the beginning of sex equals sex. Consequently, just as one is liable to receive punishment for having sexual intercourse with a menstruating woman from the time of the initial stage of intercourse, so too one violates all prohibitions against engaging in forbidden relations from the time of the initial stage of intercourse. The Gemara further asks, but if that is the source of this law, why do I need the term nida that is written with regard to a brother's wife? If you could just generally connect all of the prohibited relations to a menstruating woman by saying these are all abominations, if you do that, then why is the word nida specifically included in the prohibition to have sex with your brother's wife? And the Gemara answers that it is needed for that which Rav Huna taught. As Rav Huna said, From where in the Torah is there a hint to the halacha of a Yevama? And the Gemara expresses surprise. From where is there a hint to the law of the Yevama? Isn't it written explicitly, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her? Deuteronomy 25:5, our source for the general laws of yibum. Rather, Rav Huna meant to say, from where is there a hint that a Yevama is forbidden to her brother-in-law in her husband's lifetime, even if she is divorced from her husband? Now, we've been taking it as a given that the Torah prohibits a man to ever sleep with his brother's wife. Now we're saying we need a hint for that? Isn't that explicit? The Gemara remains puzzled. No proof is needed for this law either, as this is based on logical reasoning. From the fact that the Merciful One says the woman is permitted to her brother-in-law after her husband's death, it may be inferred that in her husband's lifetime she is forbidden to him. Now the Gemara refutes this argument. Well, perhaps after her husband's death, it is a mitzvah for her brother-in-law to marry her, whereas during her husband's lifetime, their marriage is optional. So maybe you could divorce, if your brother divorces his wife, you could step in and marry her. Alternatively, perhaps after her husband's death, yes, she is permitted to him, while during her husband's lifetime, no, they are not permitted to marry, but there is no punishment of Coerced if they do. This is because the source of the prohibition is the mitzvah for them to marry after the husband's death. And a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah has the status of a positive mitzvah, but nothing more. They're saying, is the source that you can't ever marry your brother's wife simply that in a yibum situation you can, therefore if it's not a yibum situation, you cannot. Therefore the verse states, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is impurity, nida. It's to dispel that idea. Is his brother's wife necessarily a menstruating woman? No, obviously not. Rather, she is like a menstruating woman in the following manner. Just as with regard to a menstruating woman, although she has a permitted stage afterward, right after the counts of 7 clean days and then mikvah, at the time that she is forbidden, one who has intercourse with her is liable to receive the punishment of Coerced. So too, with regard to a brother's wife, although she has a permitted stage afterward, if it's a yibum situation, during her husband's lifetime, marriage to her brother-in-law, even if your brother's divorced his wife, if you marry her and then, it's punishable by Coerced. So it's absolutely prohibited. The punishment is death at the hands of the heavenly court. So the Gemara asks, but if the source of the law, that the initial stage of intercourse is considered sexual intercourse, is as stated above, why do I need this law to be indicated by the word he'era in Leviticus 20:19 in the case of a father's sister and a mother's sister? The Gemara answers that it is needed for the dilemma that Ravina raised before Rava. With regard to one who performs the initial stage of intercourse with another male, so this is the Torah's prohibition on homosexuality, what is the law? Is it considered to be a forbidden act of homosexual intercourse? The Gemara is puzzled by this dilemma. With regard to a male, it is written explicitly, you shall not lie with a man as with a woman, Leviticus 18:22, which indicates that anything considered an act of sexual intercourse with a woman is also considered as an act of sexual intercourse with a man. Rather, the word he'era in the case of a father's sister and a mother's sister is needed to resolve the following dilemma. With regard to one who performs the initial stage of intercourse with an animal, what is the law? And Rava said to Ravina, if the word he'era does not refer to the matter of the initial stage of intercourse in the context where it is written, i.e. the prohibition with regard to a father's sister or a mother's sister, as this law is derived from a comparison based upon the statement of Rabbi Yonah, so then refer it to the matter of the initial stage of intercourse with an animal. That even if you just put it in a little and just start to have sex with an animal, you're guilty of bestiality, is an abomination, it's a huge transgression. The superfluous expression written in the case of a father's sister and a mother's sister teaches that the initial stage of intercourse is considered sexual intercourse even with an animal. So the Gemara asks, since intercourse with an animal is a prohibition for which one is liable to receive for which one is liable to receive capital punishment from the court? What is the reason that the law of the initial stage of intercourse that applies to it is written with regard to the prohibitions prescribing a father's sister and a mother's sister for which one is liable to receive coerced? Let the word ha'era be written with regard to prohibitions for which one is liable to receive capital punishment from the court. And let us derive the law with regard to a prohibition punishable by capital punishment from the court, i.e. the case of bestiality, from another prohibition punishable by capital punishment from the court. The Gemara answers, since the entire verse of a father's sister and a mother's sister comes for the purpose of an exposition, as the Gemara is about to explain, this matter, i.e. that the initial stage of intercourse is considered intercourse, is also written for the purpose of an exposition, i.e. to indicate that this principle holds true in a different context, i.e. that of bestiality. So the Gemara asks, I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, please get them in. The Gemara asks, what is the exposition that the rest of the verse introduces? As it is taught in a Baraisa, the verse, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, indicates that the prohibition applies whether she is your father's sister from his father or from his mother. Do you say that she is forbidden whether she is your father's sister from his father or from his mother? Or perhaps it is only a sister from his father, a paternal sister, a paternal half-sister, who is forbidden, but not a maternal half-sister. It may be inferred logically from the fact that the Torah rendered him liable here and rendered him liable with his sister. Just as with regard to his sister, he is liable to receive punishment whether she is his sister from his father or from his mother, so too here he is liable whether she is from his father's sister, from his father, or from his mother's sister. You can't sleep with your aunt whether she's your father's maternal half-sister or maternal or paternal half-sister. Or perhaps go this way and compare a father's sister and a mother's sister to a different law. The Torah rendered him liable here and rendered him liable with his aunt, i.e. the wife of his father's brother. Just as concerning his aunt, he is liable to receive punishment only with regard to the wife of his father's brother from his father, i.e. the wife of his father's paternal brother, and not from the wife of his father's brother, of the wife of his father's brother from his mother, i.e. the wife of his father's maternal brother. So too here he is liable only with regard to a father's sister or a mother's sister from their father, i.e. a paternal sister, not from their mother, a maternal sister. Now, I'm going to stop there because it's late on a Saturday night, and I think it's just difficult to follow all these different ramifications. But just remember, the page ends like just a little bit later. 54b ends. What they're doing now, right? Remember, they're trying to establish a source. How do you know that the beginning of sex equals sex? They're looking at several verses where that seems to be the case, but it's not tied to every case where you're having sex. So the beginning of sex equals sex for sure with a menstruating woman, but can we apply that law to the beginning of sex equals sex with a Yevama, and the beginning of sex equals sex with the prohibited relations, which are mentioned in our Mishna? And they're carefully going through the sources to see which of the connections between two. There's no single source that definitely tells that. So can they combine verses where it's implied and say these two share a common feature, which would make it a source text for applying that law where we need it? And they're just working through those cases. So I'm just stopping about half a page or a little less than half a page from where we would end otherwise. And let me see if there's any questions that Nina has passed over to me here on Yevamos 54. What's going on? Oh, I'm in the wrong document. Hold on a second. It's just refreshing. Okay, Sharon. How can anal sex be considered a means to building the brother's household? Good, Sharon. I had the same question when I read it, and I think what it seems to be saying is they're distinguishing penetration from, making out or doing other stuff like that. But it seems that penetration is dispositive, and that's why apparently, intercourse with a woman is compared to intercourse with a man, in the sense that it is intercourse when there's penetration. And they had a source for what they call in the usual way or not in the usual way. Here in the Koran is translating as typical or atypical. The Hebrew is more like in the derech or not in the derech, right? In the usual way or not in the usual way. But it's a good question. Okay, and one other question from Yosef. When it is written about uncovering nakedness in Genesis, when Ham's sons are cursed, I can gather it means that he attempted to sleep with his father, Noah's wife, rather than what some say he tried to rape his own father or his grandfather. As this term uncovered nakedness seems to be repeated in Leviticus to mean a forbidden relation with one's father's wife. From the way the sages use this term, does this make sense? Yeah, right? I mean, it seems like uncover. Well, it's weird, right? Because he says, like, his father uncovered her nakedness. That's permitted, but now he's uncovering the nakedness that his father uncovered. But it does seem that usually when this term is brought, it's because a sin has been committed, right? Somebody uncovered a nakedness they should not have uncovered. So I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, that I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. But it does seem that the phrase uncover the nakedness is always brought in the context of a transgression. And then the form of that transgression can either be, it usually means somebody you're not permitted to be with, whether, it's hard to imagine maybe that this guy somehow want to have sex with his father. So maybe it means more that he was trying to have sex with his father's wife or his grandfather's wife. Unclear in that situation, but maybe that's what you're getting at, rather than that somehow he want to have sex with his father. Like, it just seems so so much of it is unimaginable anyway. But who of us could even imagine having passed through the flood in any case? But I haven't, lately read or studied the ramifications of what happened in that sin after the flood ended and Noah got drunk, and two sons protected his modesty and the other son didn't. Some say that it wasn't even about sex, that it literally was just uncover the nakedness. But I think what you're getting at is it must not have meant simply looking at his father naked. It must have been something else going on. But I have to study that passage and the commentaries more to be able to comment. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. Yasher Koach to you, especially those on the East Coast studying at this late hour. I know a lot of people are going to be watching this on the replay. But in this chapter, we're going to, keep looking at this question of what is intercourse in several contexts. And, let's just put on our, grown-up hats and treat the questions as the sages address any questions of human behavior, really trying to uncover what is a mitzvah, what is an aveira, a sin, what is the line between the two, how can we be careful to stay. And in doing this study, we are performing the mitzvah of Torah learning like any other kind of Torah learning, and it's important. And Yasher Koach to you for starting the week right. Good vach.